Tonight, Canada welcomes world leaders to the G7 summit.
Canada's Mark Carney opens G7 summit with call for unity. G7 leaders are paralyzed by their fear of upsetting Donald Trump. Steel mills downsized, supply chains disrupted. Over 150 factory workers in Ontario laid off within weeks of Trump's tariff hike, and more jobs now hang in the balance. The G7 was supposed to be a meeting of allies, but 2025 tells a different story. At a luxury lodge in the Canadian Rockies, unity gave way to fury. Outside, protests filled the streets of Ottawa. Inside, the world watched a quiet country deliver one of the boldest diplomatic rejections in recent memory. President Trump didn't arrive to negotiate. He arrived with a threat: sweeping tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and household goods. His message was clear: fall in line or pay the price. But Canada didn't blink. In a move that stunned the G7, Prime Minister Mark Carney responded, not with slogans or fury, but with quiet force. And in that silence, he turned the tables on Trump in front of the entire world. So what changed? Why is Canada, once America's most loyal partner, now leading the resistance? And if other nations follow, what happens to U.S. leadership when even its closest friends stop listening? This wasn't just another G7. It may be the moment the world started looking for alternatives. The summit opened with electric tension. On June 15, 2025, G7 leaders gathered in Kananaskis, Alberta. The air was thick, not with mountain air, but political heat. By day one, Canada called it out. This wasn't business as usual. Enter Mark Carney, known for calm, measured diplomacy. This time, he wasn't here to charm. He came to stand firm. As the clock struck on Trump's tariff clock, Carney took the global stage. Donald Trump came not to engage, but to dictate. He dismissed calls for dialogue and doubled down on demands. His tone wasn't diplomatic, it was combative. But instead of folding, Carney flipped the script. Canada's 25% retaliatory tariffs hit hard. Launched March 4th, 2025, they targeted 30 billion Canadian dollars, 20.8 billion US dollars, worth of US imports. Canada's first wave of tariffs targeted everyday American products like kitchenware and furniture. Less than 2 weeks later, a second round expanded the pressure by focusing heavily on US steel, aluminum, and a broad range of industrial and household goods. The scale is staggering. Canada exported 75% of its goods to the US, a critical artery. By slapping tariffs on roughly 41 billion US dollars worth of imports, Canada drew a line in the sand. This was more than economic retaliation. It was a political statement. During G7 discussions, Carney did more than just negotiate. He chaired with conviction. He refused a joint communiqué. Instead, he offered a chair's summary. That decision symbolized the fractures within the alliance. Trump felt the pressure. He signed onto general language denouncing Iran, but skipped key trade talks, and quietly left early on June 16th. What followed was not just a trade standoff, it was a rupture between allies. G7 meetings were overshadowed. Trade ministers were pulled from energy and security sessions and redirected to emergency tariff negotiations. Inside the summit hall, Canada reframed the debate. Carney made tariffs, not climate, not defense, the central fault line of the G7. This was no longer about numbers on a spreadsheet. It was about leverage, pressure, and political pride. Washington had thrown the first punch, but Ottawa hit back, fast, surgical, and calibrated. Canada didn't just retaliate. It rewrote the rules of how middle powers respond when pushed to the edge. EU and Asia praised Ottawa's discipline. They saw a middle power navigating a crisis with dignity. The world media echoed the phrase, "test of moral fiber." The game had changed. That calm firmness carried into the G7 summit. Carney's leadership style stood out, measured, composed. Still, the protests remained calm. No riots, no property damage. Civic discipline was visible in every march. That restraint made the statement even louder, deciding to stand with their government, not against it. And that unity added weight to Canada's stand at the G7 table. Public sentiment intensified quickly. By late March 2025, peaceful protests had become charged with deeper meaning. Placards in Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver carried comparisons to the 1930s, the era that saw early fascism. Demonstrators weren't just upset about taxes. They were sounding an alarm about the use of economic coercion. A major Bloomberg-commissioned Nanos poll from June 1st to 3rd, 2025, found that 70% of Canadians supported retaliatory tariffs, even if it meant paying higher prices. That level of unity across parties shows this was more than a fringe reaction. It was a national consensus. What concerned people wasn't the 25% duties themselves. It was how quickly the US had slapped them on, and how earnestly Ottawa responded, proportionally but firmly. Citizens saw it as power being wielded to punish, not negotiate. Historians and analysts picked up on the parallel. They warned that when economic policy becomes a tool for political intimidation, democratic norms are at risk. Even moderate politicians in Canada spoke in unison. This was about protecting sovereignty, not profit. In the weeks leading up to the G7, that public resolve became diplomatic leverage. Canada's government pointed to the poll and the streets. It used them to justify its stance. Not to escalate, but to stand firm. Within G7 halls on June 15th, watching allies quietly referenced both the numbers and the message. This was no longer about trade deficits. It was a public referendum on power dynamics and restraint. Ottawa struck a chord because it spoke clearly. Not with threats, but with citizen power. Not with military posture, but with democratic muscle. That unity reshaped the narrative, connecting from the uprising 32,600 positions, and the unemployment rate climbed to 6.7%. Those were the initial waves. By May, unemployment hit 7%, the highest level in nearly 9 years outside of the COVID crisis, with 1.6 million Canadians jobless. These weren't temporary blips. This was sustained hardship. Canada's trade position was no longer stable. Exporters, especially in metals, auto parts, and industrial goods, were reporting sharp contractions in order volumes. Companies that once relied on predictable US demand suddenly faced canceled contracts, rerouted logistics, and tighter margins. Supply chain managers described the situation as death by delays, not because of lost demand, but because policy uncertainty made planning impossible. Across Ontario and Quebec, exporters braced for a longer freeze. Behind these figures are fractured livelihoods. Factory workers face uncertain futures. Families are grappling with higher bills on top of lower pay. Businesses are recalibrating entire supply lines. This wasn't a risk anymore. It was reality. No more distant warnings. These economic blows hit national GDP growth, consumer confidence, and even Canada's fiscal projections. But Carney sees this as part of a broader strategy. These first casualties send a message. Canada will wear the pain, but Canada won't cower. By turning real economic pressure into diplomatic leverage, Ottawa forces the US to take notice. The trade war is no longer theoretical. It's in factory floors, shopping carts, and family budgets. And that economic strain is precisely Canada's signal to Trump. Negotiate, or feel more of this. Together, Canada is already down, but not out. The G7 summit turned into a chessboard, no longer a roundtable for allies, but a front line of competing stances. By June 15, 2025, leaders arrived in Kananaskis. The tone was different. Instead of unity, the summit highlighted fractures. Countries spoke with caution. Canada, once just another host, had seized the narrative. Trump no longer sat at the helm. He was treated as one to be checked. His early departure on June 16th underscored the shift, not just in mood, but in perceived authority. Allies quietly supported Canada's firm approach. In closed-door sessions, G7 diplomats avoided public applause for tariffs. Yet behind the scenes, many nodded in private. Canada's restraint and resolve had earned them silent credit. The group sidestepped a traditional communiqué. Instead, Trump tried to steer the conversation. He floated the idea of a US-Canada deal within 30 days. He emphasized his identity as a tariff person and hinted that Canada might need to accept some duties in return. But it was clear he was on defense. Europeans and Asian partners watched closely. Reports noted that Germany's Merz and UK's Starmer exchanged supportive glances when Canada's position was raised. Nobody cheered openly, but the message was understood. Had become the moral and strategic leader. Ottawa had redefined ally, not someone who tolerates pressure, but one who stands firm. When Trump left early, he left behind an altered summit. Canada's move had redrawn the map of influence. For that moment, unity wasn't about consensus. It was about recognizing that power in the G7 had shifted, even without a word from Washington. Shifting from streets to summit, the scene in Ottawa told the real story. Trump arrived in convoy on June 15th. But his aura of power didn't hold. Instead, Canada's streets echoed silent but potent resistance. By June 14th, tens of thousands had already taken to Ottawa's sidewalks, joining the global No Kings movement that spanned over 2,100 cities and drew more than 5 million participants worldwide. On those streets, a simple message was written in chalk and raised on signs. We see you, and we will no longer be silent. This wasn't a rally. There were no chants or speeches. Protesters simply stood still. Their body language spoke volumes. They didn't need slogans. They refused to bow. That silent stance reached inside the G7. Within the halls, diplomats passed discreet nods. On TV screens, muted images of Ottawa's crowds played in the background. It was a quiet statement that needed no amplification. Trump's motorcade moved through, but nothing followed. The crowd parted, but their stillness remained their voice. It was the kind of protest that gets under the skin, not through noise, but through the power of collective eyeballing. This moment went global. Images of calm resistance aired across European networks. Analysts noted how the lack of chance made the statement sharper. It was a chess move. Let power pass. Watch them think twice. That atmosphere carried into June 16th when Trump exited early, not because of noise, but presence. He left in his motorcade, but without the command he expected. Canada had flipped the script. The summit host wasn't just hosting, it was guiding. The host nation held a mirror to power and said clearly, "We will no longer sit quietly beneath your rules." That silent resolve speaks louder than any press release. And in geopolitics, when an entire population stands still and refuses to move, it's not protest, it's protocol. And Canada just rewrote the code. Trump came to the G7 without a solution. Only pressure. But instead of standing tall at the table he once dominated, he found himself isolated. In a summit built on American leadership, the United States was no longer leading. And the pushback didn't come from rivals. It came from Canada, Washington's closest partner. Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't lash out. He stood firm. He didn't shout. He showed restraint. His message? trust isn't built with threats. It's earned through respect. From Parliament Hill to the sidewalks of Toronto, Canadians made their voices clear. Not through violence, not through slogans, but by drawing a line in silence and daring the world to notice. This year's G7 wasn't just a diplomatic spat, it was a turning point. The old alliance order cracked. European leaders hesitated. Japan treaded carefully, and in that hesitation, a new question emerged. Are smaller nations finally ready to redraw the map of global power? Is this just about Trump, or is this the beginning of something bigger? A new kind of alliance? A quiet rebellion against superpower pressure?